And it's a privilege to be with you all tonight. My name is Laura Watson, if I haven't met you, and glad that you have joined MMFA to talk about a topic that I know is not necessarily easy to talk about. So whether you're here because you're facing a budget gap or because you want to be proactive about your congregation's financial future, you're in the right place. Over the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to take a look at something that MMFA believes that all churches need to be thinking about, and that's alternative income streams. But before we dive in, I want to take a quick poll. So if you would like, and if your camera is on, raise your hand if your congregational giving has felt a little unpredictable in the past few years. If over the last 2, 3, 4 years, you feel like giving in your church has been a little bit unpredictable, just do a quick hand raise. And also raise your hand if you think that your church building has unused space during the week, if there are spaces in your facility that are sitting empty throughout the week. So if you raise your hand to either or both of those, you're in the right place. You see here on the screen what we're going to cover together tonight. First, we will look at the realities that so many of our churches are navigating, and then we'll explore 5 different income streams, real things that real churches are doing. You'll hear about Moravian churches that have already started efforts in these different areas. After that, we'll talk a little bit about how to shift your congregation's financial culture, because we know you could have 5 really great ideas for a potential new income stream, but that won't go anywhere if you don't get buy-in from the folks at your church. So we're going to talk about shifting culture. And then finally, we'll spend some time discerning next steps, how to get started, share some resources with you, and then we'll leave time for some conversations, some questions and answers at the end. And my hope is that you will leave inspired for where your church should start, with one idea, one first step to take after being part of this webinar tonight. So let's first look at some of the realities that our congregations are facing. Churches are dealing with a lot right now, and you see some examples of those things there on the screen. Bills are going up, especially utility bills. For many congregations, giving has not returned to where it was before the pandemic. And as our world continues to feel very uncertain, very volatile even, especially when it comes to the economy, many people are just not comfortable making a financial commitment to their church. They're worried about affordability and all kinds of cost of living, all those different things. And so they're less likely to want to make any kind of commitment to the church. We also know that for many of our congregations, you're just not seeing people coming to worship as regularly as they used to, and that can lead to a decrease in income. And yet we know that our call to mission is the same, and to love our neighbors. We are still called to do that. Our buildings still need care and attention, and certainly we want to have church staff that is cared for and well paid. So even as we face these uncertain, uneven terrain, uncertain waters, we know that God is still calling us to ministry and to do things to care for our neighbors. So I want to say something really important before we go any further, which is that if your church is struggling financially, first of all, you're not alone. And second of all, that doesn't mean that you're failing. It means that you're living in this very real time in which we live, very real economy with real people who are trying to figure it all out. And so it doesn't mean that you're failing. But the faithful response to this isn't despair. It's not to stick our heads in the sand and hope it will all change magically, or even to let's just keep doing what we've been doing and hope for different results, right? The faithful response to these pressures that we're facing is creativity and it's courage. But we know that those things are a very Moravian response. Moravians have a long history of creativity and courage, especially when it came to finances. If you read about our early Moravians back in the 1700s as they established themselves here on the continent, they were supporting their work through a really efficient system of communal labor and commercial networks. They weren't relying on one source of income. So what does that mean for us today? I like to say that when we think about a financial stool at our church, the financial stewardship part of our church, traditionally we have thought about 3 different legs. One of those was the offering plate, income from passing the plate. The second financial leg of our stool was planned giving, and then the third, capital giving. So given, though, the times in which we live, we need to add a fourth leg to our financial stewardship stool, and that's alternative income streams. So as we think about those innovative sources of income, we're not doing something radical. We're doing something that actually our forebears in the past did really well. And they did it, again, with creativity and courage. So carry those two words with you. We're going to ask how we can sustain and even grow our work in the world. And that's a really holy question, and one that we definitely should be asking. So again, as we think about realities that our churches today are experiencing, there's especially related to financial pressures. We remember that financial struggle doesn't mean mission failure. We remember that the church has always found creative ways to fund its work. We accept that faithful stewardship means asking hard questions, not avoiding them. It means looking in the mirror and being honest about what we see, and then giving ourselves permission to do something about it without fear and with imagination. I love this passage from Isaiah as you think about exploring innovative income sources for your ministry. Behold, we are doing a new thing. So I want to encourage you to do that new thing and to embrace these new ideas without fear, and to give yourselves permission to think differently. So quickly, an overview of the 5 different income streams that we're going to look at tonight that I think could begin to transform your church's financial sustainability. We are going to take, I like to say, a balcony level view of each of these. We're not going to go in depth into them because that would be a separate webinar for each one on its own. So we'll just take a big picture view of it, focus on sort of general benefits and tips and considerations. I do want to say, as you look at this list here, property, income, grants, social enterprise, partnerships, and then financial stewardship, none of these are a silver bullet. So if you're possibly backed into a corner right now, really feeling some pressure around income and struggling to pay bills, obviously you need money, and you need money quickly. These alternative income streams take time, and they're not a magic wand that you can just wave and suddenly there's a lot of extra money flowing in. So I want to make sure that we have realistic expectations as we consider these. They're not quick fixes. But as we just talked about, the offering plate cannot be our only source of income, nor should it necessarily be the primary source anymore as we look at those other legs of the stool. So these are going to be some possible paths forward for you to consider as you add that alternative income leg to your financial stool. So let's look first at property income. This, I think, is sort of the friendliest of the 5, possibly even the easiest to step into. So as you think about your church building, it may be one of the most underutilized assets that you have. Think about how many hours it's occupied versus how many hours it sits empty, especially spaces that are rarely used except maybe on a Sunday. And begin to imagine what can happen in those spaces during all these hours that possibly they're sitting empty. Some congregations just simply rent out facilities like a fellowship hall, let's say, for families to use for events and celebrations, things like that. So one-off rentals. I know I did a quick Google and then verified to make sure my Google results were correct by visiting church websites. And I learned that Clemens Moravian, Union Cross Moravian here in North Carolina are renting facilities. New Dorp up in New York, Emmaus in Pennsylvania. I'm sure there are a lot more. So whether it's, again, to members in the community for a family celebration, to a local group, possibly like a homeschool co-op, or maybe there's an individual like a caterer who needs space and you've got a licensed commercial kitchen. There are a lot of possibilities for renting your church property that can give you a steady stream of income, especially if you find someone that's renting it regularly. And this can also increase your visibility in the community, increase your connections in the community. So there are benefits to renting out properties you see here on the slide. There's also things to watch out for and to think about before you step into this. Things like zoning restrictions, your church's property insurance policy, what goes into a rental agreement or a contract, as well as a rental that could potentially trigger some income tax for you. And we're going to talk more about that UBIT when we get towards the end. But if you are considering renting your fellowship hall to a for-profit entity on a regular basis, the IRS could flag that as unrelated business income tax. So that's just something to be aware of. Again, we'll touch more on that towards the end. I do want to share there's a wonderful program out there that MMFA is happy to connect you with. It comes from an organization called Rooted Good. And at the end, we'll have a resource slide that will be on it. Their program is called How to Rent Well, and it walks you, your church board, through discernment around what space might we rent and who might we rent it to, how much should we charge, all those key aspects as you start thinking about renting your church property or expanding how you're renting it. So we highly recommend utilizing something like that. And again, happy to connect you with it. One of the best books that I've read about alternative income sources for churches is called Funding Forward, and it's by a woman named Grace Pomeroy, who works for the Luther Seminary in a program they have called Faith Plus Lead, which again, I'll reference when we get to resources at the end. But in her book, Grace follows all kinds of ministries that pursue alternative income to help the church's financial situation. And one of the things that she sees in the churches who flounder a little bit is that they lose sight of God in the conversation. It becomes so much about earning extra money and securing that for the church's future that they forget to stay aligned with their mission and how God is calling them. So in her book, Grace lists up questions that she thinks ministries need to be asking as they begin to discern whether they're going to pursue something like renting property. So here on the slide, you see the 3 questions that Funding Forward lists up for you to think about. And again, I think asking these kinds of questions, no matter what you're considering, is really important to keep folks centered on the ministry and where God is in all this conversation, because this can be scary, it can be overwhelming. And so just the reminder that God is present in all of it. And if we stop and listen and prayerfully discern, God is going to help lead us where we need to go. So love these questions and hope that your church would consider asking them, talking about them as you determine whether you want to rent property. So that is income stream number 1. Let's look at number 2, which is grants. So here, as you think about applying for a grant, you may immediately say, well, hey, Laura, we're a faith-based organization. That means a lot of grant money is not available to us. It is true. There are a lot of organizations that will not rent to grant to religiously affiliated groups. But there is money that's out there that's specifically designated for congregations that are doing work in their community. And oftentimes that goes unclaimed because churches think that there's not money for them. So grant funding for churches usually comes from one of 3 places. One, of course, is your denomination, the Moravian Church, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. Number 2, source of grants are local foundations, community foundations, or even a state foundation. And then third, our government even has funding set aside for grants for churches that are doing services like a food program or a rural health initiative. So do not presume that because you are a church, you're not eligible for grants. If you're running a food pantry or hosting a clothing closet or offering any kind of community program, you might be eligible for grants that support that work directly. The key here is that grants are not going to give you money for your operations. You're not going to get a grant to pay your light bill, but you could get a grant to help fund your feeding ministry, which is going to free up that congregational giving for other things. So what I would encourage you to think about is what you're already doing, what ministries and outreach mission is your congregation already involved in. Make a list, even things that you think are small, put them in the list, and then start doing some Googling and reaching out, again, to community foundations, to other nonprofits in your area to find out what grants might exist for this kind of work. Grant seeking, as you look there at those considerations, it's a time-consuming job, and to get really large grants requires typically somebody that's got some professional expertise in grant writing. We also know that grants come with reporting requirements, so it's really important that you think about who will be doing this. It's not the pastor's job. It's not something that should land on their shoulders. They can certainly be part of it, but you need some lay leaders that are going to take this on. And you need to be realistic about what they're able to do. So the last consideration that you see there is whether you might want to establish your own 501c3 separate from the church. This is sometimes what ministries do to make more grants available to them without that religious affiliation. An example of that I can think about is East Hills Moravian Church, which is in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. They started a freezer ministry where they would make homemade soups and things in the church kitchen. They would freeze them and then have those foods to start giving away to folks in the church, then to folks who needed meals in the community. And as that expanded and more churches got involved, they quickly realized, let's establish our own separate 501c3 organization with the IRS, because it will give us access to potential grants that we can't get if we stay under the East Hills Moravian Church umbrella. So that group is now called the Freezer Ministry and Garden Growers. They are expanding to do work in another city near Bethlehem. So that's just a great example of a way to make yourself be able to take advantage of more grants as you expand ministry and outreach that you're doing in a specific area. So one thing I will be happy to do for any of these income streams is to connect you with folks in Moravian churches that are actually doing the things, so that you've got somebody to talk to and have conversation with. So just know that for all of these. Some questions to think about, again, as you're considering how to apply for grants, whether you should apply for grants. And these are, again, from Grace Pomeroy's Funding Forward book. I really like the third one. I think, again, understandably, as we know we need more money to do the ministry that we're called to do, we're quick to try to grab at what we can get, and we may lose sight of this important point, which is that we have to be prepared to faithfully steward grants that we receive. And that's not just financially, but in prayer and in accountability and community. So important things to think about as you're exploring what grants your ministry might apply for. And now we've got income stream number 3, social enterprise, which tends to be the income stream that is the most unfamiliar to the church. Simply put, it's a business activity run by your congregation that serves both a community need and generates revenue for the church. So something like starting a preschool program in your church building and charging money for that, turning an underutilized space into a community coffee shop are some examples. So as you think about social enterprise, it's really, really important to start small and to be thinking about how you're going to reinvest those profits into ministry and how you're going to measure outcomes, both missional and financial. One of my favorite Moravian examples of social enterprise comes from a congregation in Madison, Wisconsin, the Lakeview Moravian congregation. They discerned the need to merge their congregation with a Lutheran congregation that was also in their area. So they merged and became Common Grace. And Common Grace then realized that they wanted to establish, as their social enterprise, they wanted to establish the Eastmoreland Community Center, which would be a physical space utilizing the church's campus where they would rent that space to different groups in the community and generate income. But they would also host community events and ask people to make donations, pay what you can for different events. So again, income for the church that they were earning through that. So that is a wonderful way for them to be establishing that business where they're making money, but also having community impact. Another example is Union Cross Moravian Church, which is here in North Carolina. They run a thrift shop in a building that's right next door to their sanctuary. And so they're meeting some community needs to have affordable home goods and clothing and all those great things you find at a thrift shop for people in the community. And they're also earning income for the church. So the question to be thinking about here is, what does our community need? And what assets does our church have, gifts that we have that can help us meet that need? So again, if you're thinking about social enterprise, it's important to be aware of your people, to start small, think about who your volunteers are, what kind of capacity and energy they have, because it takes a lot of that, especially to get started. Typically, social enterprises can take 2, maybe 3 years to really start generating income. So you've got to have folks that can commit to something like that over the course of that time frame. It's also really helpful to be thinking about what your congregation is passionate about, because if you're picking a possible business entity and it's something that folks are already motivated and it's meeting a community need where there's already energy, that's going to help get more volunteers than if it's purely about money. So be thinking about, again, where are our gifts and our assets and our energy right now that could translate into a business venture. The other thing to be thinking about too, of course, is the UBIT. We're going to talk about that towards the end, but some of these, if not done well, can trigger some unrelated business income tax. So we, again, wanting to make sure whatever you're doing is connected to mission and ministry in your church. So some questions to ask as you're thinking about social enterprise. Again, ministries in the congregation that might be a good fit. Starting from scratch is possible, but look at what's already there and that might translate into some income generation for the church. And our fourth income stream to think about is partnerships, because sometimes you don't have to do a new program or start a new business. You look at existing relationships that might generate some income. So think about those organizations that are already at work in your community, local nonprofits, the school system, healthcare systems, county agencies, things like that, because a lot of them might need space in different ways. So you've got church property that could be available, and they might need a trusted partner, and they may have a budget for this kind of thing. So some possibilities here are partnering with the county health department and letting your church be a site for a monthly wellness event or a vaccine clinic. Possibly partnering with a local nonprofit that's doing food distribution. You could become a feeding hub if they need more space and get a small stipend for that. If you've got a huge parking lot, maybe your local county emergency management office needs another staging point in the community, and you could receive compensation for that designation. So there's all kinds of ideas here. The important thing to think about is organizations that are aligned with your church's values, connections that you might already have existing within the congregation, and the different things that you might be able to share throughout the partnership. You see here on the slide some considerations. It's obviously really important that you are clear on what you're agreeing to. What are we saying yes to in this partnership? Have some kind of formalized agreement. You also want to make sure that the partnership is with an organization that has exemplary leadership, has a good reputation in the community. You want to be proud of this partnership, and it needs to, again, align with the mission of your congregation. So things to think about here. Partnership that I'll lift up that I know exists in the Moravian Church is Calvary Moravian, which is here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. They partner with our local, one of our local bookstores, which happens to be about a street over from the church. And so the bookstore utilizes space at Calvary for book events, book festivals, author speeches, that kind of thing. And then Calvary also benefits not just financially, but the bookstore is willing to give donations when Calvary works with students at a local elementary school and does Christmas bags for them. The bookstore has donated books for those bags before. So it's a partnership that obviously is an income stream for the church, but also has some other benefits and is reciprocal as well. So again, be thinking about the folks in your congregation that have connections with those different organizations in the community, whether it's a nonprofit or in the school system, healthcare system, et cetera, and what could a partnership look like that might generate some revenue for you. As I just said, questions to think about. Who has those connections with a potential partner? It's much easier to start with an existing relationship than to start building a new one. Making sure that that partnership is aligning with the focus of the church, God's call for your church, and being careful that it wouldn't cause any kind of theological conflict. So a partnership just for the sake of money is something to be wary of because of these exact things. You want to make sure it aligns with what your ministry values and that it doesn't cause any kind of theological challenge. And finally, I couldn't offer this webinar tonight without also asking you to think of your how you can strengthen your ongoing financial stewardship efforts, what you do to form generous stewards in your congregation. If your automatic response to this is, we don't talk about stewardship well at the church, or, oh, we've done everything we can here, this is not a viable stream for us, would like for you to be willing to try some new efforts here. I think the easiest thing to do is to let Jesus show the way. Jesus was a model steward. MMFA has a program that you can do in your congregation that looks at 4 different ways Jesus lived as a steward. So you're asking people to discipleship, right? We're following Jesus. So what did Jesus do that was stewardship? And you're encouraging people to follow Jesus' example. If you don't like talking about money in the church, or even it's just a taboo topic, which is so true. We tend to keep faith and finances into very separate boxes, which sometimes is detrimental to our ministries. Let Jesus be the one talk. If you've ever done any of the MFA's webinars before, you've heard me say this. Let Jesus's words be the words that you use. Jesus talked a lot about money, we know, in the New Testament. So certainly being willing to share what Jesus was saying about how our relationship with money could impact our relationship with God is really, really important. Other things that are helpful here as you think about financial stewardship is how you make it very explicit, the connection between money and mission. So you invite people to financially support the church. What is the mission that's happening as a result of that? So whether that's through storytelling or really intentional offertory invitations, narrative budgets, there's all kinds of ways you can do this. Happy to talk more with you about that. You're forming stewards and you're helping them see, hey, my gift of this helped us do this ministry, which inspires people to want to be a part of that because it's about God's call for the church and not just about the church's budget, right? So finally, including plan giving. This continues to be an area that I know for churches is a challenge to add to that, again, the financial stool, to have folks talking about plan gifts, but it's really, really important. And as we look at the ages of our folks in our pews, we know they are at a time of life where they are thinking about their estate planning if they haven't already worked on it. So making sure they know the church is a place that they're supporting during their life and that they can also support even beyond their lifetime. So MMFA, happy to help you set up some plan giving conversations and even meet with people individually to talk about their plans and see what they might want to do to support the church. So just know that's something that we are ready to help you with. If you choose, and I really hope that you will, to strengthen your financial stewardship conversations and efforts, first thing to be thinking about, watch out for, is what you're saying, the messaging, the tone that you're setting. Yes, the church needs more money. That is very true. But that's not the messaging and the tone that you're setting. It's not about paying bills. It's about talking about what God wants for us. Again, Jesus's words, Jesus's model as a steward. God entrusts so much to us, and God wants us to use that to make the world a better place. So that's the kind of tone that you're setting. So be thoughtful about that, as well as the timing of what you're doing in terms of education and formation for stewardship. Ideally, it's not just once a year. It's ongoing throughout the year. MMFA is happy to help with that if you want to identify some different ways to be focusing on financial stewardship specifically, or just general stewardship throughout the year. And then finally, you see your why. So again, this is, if you're going to invite me to make a gift of time or talent or treasure, whatever it is, for God's work through the church, being able to tell me why I should do it. So that's, again, not about the budget, but because of what it means for me as a disciple, as a child of God. God wants something for us. And as we follow Jesus, this helps people see how their acts of stewardship are enabling the church to do God's work and to follow God's call for the congregation. So knowing that why and being able to say, here's why we give to the church, why we are a community of faith, and what we're about is really important. So some questions to think about as you're discerning some steps for financial stewardship. And these are from MMFA. First of all, what do you believe about stewardship at your church? If you start using that word, you better make sure folks are clear on what it means and what you believe about it. So spending some time being able to answer that. Happy to facilitate that conversation with whoever needs to have it at your church. How do you let people know what you believe about stewardship and what that word means? And then how do people, again, understand that their gift enables the church to do what? So you've got generations of people who No, giving to the church means things like paying the light bill, but you've got other generations that really like to understand, what can the church accomplish? Tell me the story. Tell me about mission and ministry. I want to be a part of that. So being able to answer these questions will serve you well if you start exploring some additional financial stewardship efforts this year. So this to me is the fun thing to talk about. Let's transition into something that may be less fun, but it's really important for you to understand some basics around unrelated business income tax. We could do an entire webinar on this. We're not going to. Again, just want you to understand what it is and some things that can trigger it, and just ideas that you need to carry with you as you start looking at some of these income streams. So you see there a very simple definition of UBIT, which is income tax resulting from activities that are not substantially related to your exempt mission. Your exempt mission is the reason why your church exists, that was given to the IRS. So if you're under a provincial umbrella, which a lot of our churches are, they aren't on their own standalone entity with the IRS. That's that mission. So it probably has something to do with worship and community outreach, that kind of thing. So make sure that your church itself has a mission statement that clearly articulates what you are all about, because that's another piece that the IRS would want to see as it looks at income if you start having income from things besides your offering plate. So understanding that's really important. And then these bullets that are here on the slide as well. Typically, renting your property is safe. It's generally exempt from UBIT. Some of the risks there, if you have a mortgage on your building, or again, if you're renting regularly to a for-profit versus a nonprofit or a community group. So, but rental income is typically a safe way to be pursuing some alternative income. Mission connection is essential. So if you're earning regular income from an activity that's related to your mission, that's not going to be considered UBIT. So let's say you've got a recovery ministry that works with folks who are coming out of incarceration, or perhaps overcoming addiction. So that's a ministry that your church has, and you decide to launch a small landscaping company so that those folks can work and get some income, and the church gets some income as well. The IRS would look at that and say, hey, that's mission aligned. That's part of who you are as an organization, so you don't need to pay tax on that. But if you've got somebody in your church that just owned its own landscaping company, is now retired, decides not to sell the business, the church decides to open its own landscaping business, that is going to be treated as a taxable income, because it has nothing to do with the mission and ministry of your church. So just being thoughtful again about how it connects to what you're all about in terms of mission and ministry is really important. So the IRS, again, is going to look at what you're doing as well as why you're doing it. So exemptions can apply. You see a few of those in bullet 3. So if you've got volunteers that are doing the work, that typically is going to help you avoid having to pay tax on the income. If your church receives donated goods and then sells those goods, that income is not taxed. Or if the income is coming from member convenience activities, you're going to avoid UBIT there. What is a member convenience activity? I can think of a great example from my own church, Home Moravian. We have a group that makes soup called the Soup Group, and we make it and we freeze it, and then it's available to members to take to others who need it, share with the community however we want to, but also several times a year we sell it to church members. We set up a table after worship on a Sunday, and folks come by and pay $10 a quart for soup. Since we are selling that soup to members, it doesn't trigger any kind of income tax because it's a member convenience activity. So again, if you offer a coffee fellowship after worship and you put a basket out for donations, not at risk of triggering any kind of income tax because it's your members that are paying for it. So that's what member convenience activities means. Important thing to be thinking about here is how you can document everything. If you've got extra income coming in, how does that connect to your mission? And we would always recommend that you consult with the province, potentially, a lawyer, or certainly a CPA who's familiar with nonprofit rules before you start exploring social enterprise, property rental, because those are the two areas that can trigger the UBIT. All right, let's spend a few minutes on shifting financial culture. Again, why do we do that? Because you may have already made a list of some really great ministries your church is doing that might possibly turn into some income generators. But if the culture around money in your congregation is unhealthy, you might hit some obstacles. So it's important to sort of assess and identify ways to overcome obstacles before you move forward. So here on the slide, you see some tips. Name it theologically. So use the Bible. Again, follow Jesus's example. Use Jesus's words as you start talking about money and ministry. Money is not a taboo topic in Scripture. As I said, stewardship is a core part of our discipleship. So make that so at your church. Talk about what it means to be a steward based on what the Bible tells us about that. Be sure you're telling the story, the financial story of your church and how money is enabling mission and ministry to happen. Also, make sure that more people are involved. If you've got just a small group that's been doing financial decision making, you involve more people. Why should we do that? Because that gets more voices in the conversation, can help spark creativity, but people tend to support what they help build. So as you are talking about the financial realities of your congregation, sort of sharing what the pieces are to the puzzle, and then begin to say, we're considering some different income sources. Maybe this is just with your board initially, making sure everybody's involved in that conversation, elders and trustees, unified board, whoever it is. If you've got a stewardship committee, get them in there too, finance committee, whoever it is, so that you've got buy-in and more folks who are engaging with the conversation. And I know it can be hard if you're in financial crisis at all or feel sort of backed into the corner, you know you need money right away. You want to move to action, but this kind of shifting of culture takes time. I like to say it moves at the pace of trust. So this is about building trust in the congregation and knowing that that doesn't happen overnight. So considerations here are leadership, who's leading the effort. That's back to the tone that they're setting and the positivity and the confidence that they have, the trust that they have in the congregation is really important. Identify ways to be transparent. This doesn't mean, oh, we're going to start publishing our shortfall in our church communications every week, because study after study shows that that doesn't inspire people to give more. So transparency doesn't necessarily equal here's deficit, deficit, deficit. However, you want to make sure folks know the realities of the situation. Oftentimes when MFA steps in, we hear people say, we didn't know the church was struggling this much financially. We wish we had known sooner. So there's ways to do this in a healthy way. MFA is happy to help. We have a whole resource on this. So let us know if you need it. And then finally, make sure you have a plan. Again, if you're feeling anxious about money and feeling responsible for it at your church, you want to jump into action quickly and try to generate some more revenue for the church. Understandable. But have a plan. Take the time to involve people with the plan. Identify outcomes you're hoping for, realities, possible barriers, all that kind of good stuff. Know how you're going to try to achieve what you're going for, and take the time to do that so that you can, again, be shifting the culture around how you talk about money at your church and how folks will possibly receive some of these different income streams. It is common for churches to say, oh, we don't want to rent space. People aren't going to take care of it. And it's true. Sometimes there are bad renters. So there's going to be all kinds of fear and hesitations. So having a well thought out plan with leaders who are setting a great tone, that are trustworthy and who are transparent appropriately is really going to help as you start moving closer to acting on social enterprise or property rental or any of the other income streams. So we've covered a lot of ground already. So let's spend a little bit of time on where your church might start. Before we get into that, I do want to remind us of something that we all know from Scripture, which is a story that Jesus tells about 3 servants who were each given resources to steward. And the landowner went away, and 2 of those servants put their resources to work, the resources that were entrusted in, they put them to work, generated some income. But we know that the 3rd servant didn't do anything. He buried his out of fear and returned exactly what he'd been given when the landowner came back, nothing more. And the owner, we know, was not impressed. And when I think about this story, especially as it relates to alternative income, the servant who failed wasn't because he was a bad person. He was just afraid, right? He was waiting and he wanted to be safe. He wasn't sure what to do. And we may feel that same way. I imagine if I asked you to raise your hand, some of you might raise your hand and say, we're a little bit afraid. We're not sure what to do. We're wanting to be safe, of course. We want to faithfully care for what we have. We should. We want to be safe, and perhaps we're waiting. But Jesus says that's not faithfulness. Faithfulness is doing something with what you've been given. So that's a hard nudge from our Lord to be thinking about what's entrusted to us and what can we do with it. So what has your congregation been given, and what can you do with it that might help you generate a little extra money to support the mission and ministry in the life of the church? So you see those simple questions that are there on the screen. There's 4 of them. What do you already have? If you've ever done asset mapping, this is exactly that. If you haven't done asset mapping, happy to lead it for you. So that's making lists of properties, skills, relationships, programs, everything that you've got, and seeing how you can combine them in different ways for mission and ministry and possibly for an income stream. So don't overlook some things that are already there. It's easy to say, hey, what's going to be the new thing? But take a look at what you've already got. There may be more. You may be richer in those assets than you realize. Number 2, what does your community need? Not what you assume they need or what they needed 10 years ago when you started a program, or even 20 or 30 years ago, but what do they need today? What do they tell you when you spend time listening to them about what they need? So spend some time just going out and having conversations with local officials, school leaders, nonprofit leaders, etc. Those community partners, hopefully, that you already have. Call them up. Can I spend an hour talking to you about needs? Our church is discerning some stuff, and just listen and find out, because that might point you in the direction of something that you've got that could help meet a need and generate some income. So listen before you start doing anything and building anything. Third, where does your congregation have any energy? I think I've touched on this a little bit already, but it's really crucial. You could have the best, most financially promising idea in the world, but it could fail if nobody's excited about it. So you've got to find that intersection of what you have, what the community needs, what the congregation's excited and passionate about, and then where God is. So if we had our Venn diagram, we put those 3 circles of assets that you have, community needs, congregational energy and gifts and skills. And at the middle, there should be God calling you to action, calling you to show up, right? So always making sure that you're considering, where is God calling us with all of this? So my encouragement to you is, though, to look at that answer. Pick one thing. You don't need to do 5. You don't need to do 3. Just pick one thing. Plan for it. Take time to work on it and make all the steps. Have conversations. Learn from others who've done it, etc. Build trust within the congregation around it, in the community, and then take that step forward. So most of the churches that I know of, and especially if you read Grace Pomeroy's book, Funding Forward, they transformed their financial health, not overnight. It wasn't one dramatic pivot, but they did do a faithful experiment that they planned for and worked toward, and that gave them courage for the next one. So one small step is going to set you off in a new direction. I want to quickly look at some resources, and then see if there's any questions, have some time for conversation. I mentioned Rooted Good early on, and their How to Rent Well. You see a little screen grab of the cover of that program. I'd be happy to get that to you. It again steps you through all the things you need to be thinking about as you determine what to rent and who to rent it to, etc. They also have the resource, What About Taxes? It is a deeper dive into that unrelated business income tax and other things to be considering as you look at these income streams. So those are 2 resources to be happy to put in your hands if you don't already have them. You've got their website there as well to be able to download different things from them. Some of their products come with a cost. So if you find one that you're interested in and it's got a price tag on it and that's an obstacle for you, let me know. Chances are we can access it for you either for free or at a discounted rate. So be happy to help you look at those tools and make sure that they can get into your hands for no cost to your church. You see faithlead.org, that's the Luther Seminary's organization. That's Grace Pomeroy, the author that I mentioned of that book. You see the cover there, Funding Forward. That book is rich with resources, again, for each of these income streams and real stories of churches that did things for social enterprise and property rental, etc. So it might give you some inspiration and some thoughtfulness around what direction to go in as you look at what you might possibly pursue. Churchleadership.com, that's the Lewis Center for Church Leadership, wonderful resource, constantly posting articles and interviews and videos and blogs and all the things. Would encourage you for any of these, sign up for their e-newsletters, because what I found, especially for lay leaders in churches that have full-time jobs or are busy in retirement with travel and other wonderful retirement things, it helps to have something coming in that reminds you to be reading and thoughtful about this topic. So all of those first three all have phenomenal news communications and monthly kinds of things that can land in your inbox. Excuse me. The Wesley CDC, again, is a denominational resource, but they've got wonderful, they're all in on alternative income streams. And so they can give you some great ideas as well. And of course, have listed our website and remind you to reach out to your provincial and your district offices. I know there's a lot of grant money available for different congregations in the Northern Province, different organizations that do grants like Larger Life Foundation, Society for Promoting the Gospel. And there's some grant money available in the Southern Province as well. And of course, through MMFA's grant program too. And I am skipping ahead right into my next slide, which is grant resources. MMFA's cycle is getting ready to start June 1st. So I'd be happy to talk to you. Give me a call, send me an email. Let's set up a time to share more about our grant program. We do that once a year and have funds in all different kinds of areas. And again, provincial district offices. And then I did a quick search to find some grants available for faith-based organizations and to dig into some of these sites a little bit. Walmart Spark Good, grants to churches. These are smaller amounts, but they're exactly money to help you with some of your community outreach. So again, if you're doing anything to feed folks or clothe folks, et cetera, it's money for that sort of thing that would free up your congregational offering plate income for other areas. So that's one possibility. Again, if you've got a local community foundation in your city, in your state, a lot of those have funds that can benefit churches. And if you're thinking about capital improvements, I listed two here. The National Fund for Sacred Places is only for historic church buildings. So you'd have to look at their site to kind of determine, does our building qualify as a historic space? Calvary Moravian here in Winston-Salem just got a $300,000 grant from them for roof and steeple replacement. Calvary's building is several hundred years old, so they are a historic site. So that's their qualification for National Fund for Sacred Places. The Oldham Little Church Foundation, however, it doesn't matter the age of your building, but if you have a need for capital improvements, that could be a possible source. So I know there are a lot more out there. Again, it takes time to do this research, and MFA is constantly doing it just to try to help churches with it. But again, if you've got some lay leaders in your congregation, ask them, hey, can you take an hour and just spend some time on the internet searching grant sources for churches? That could lead to some information that would be really helpful. And MFAs are always happy to help sort of vet lists and let you know if we know anything about the organizations that you find. So enough of me. Let's open up for questions. Pause for a moment. Let me stop sharing my screen so I can see your faces. And I'm going to stop the recording. So just bear with me here for a second. And let me stop that recording.